Madeleine Walker,
I'm Mary Pelson.
and we decided to attack the health disparities problem under the governance category. And so our aim is to utilize microloans to increase the use of micronutrients in Indigenous Guatemalan communities, um, and in hopes of improving nutrition for Guatemalan children and mothers. So malnutrition in Guatemala is a big problem. Even the government acknowledges the situation. 70% of Indigenous Guatemalans experience stunted growth, and this is a result of protein deficiencies, iron deficiencies, caloric deficiencies. But current government policies in developing countries such as Guatemala don't emphasize micronutrient outcomes. They instead promote fortifying staples, which provides energy and protein, but lacks in the micronutrients that are so needed to increase the nutrition of Guatemalan children and families. So when I was in Guatemala this summer, I worked with an NGO that focused a lot on the leafy indigenous vegetables that grew in abundance in the mountainous regions where so many indigenous people live. And these vegetables have very high rates of protein and iron in them, which is what is specifically needed to improve the malnutrition situation. Yeah.
And these evidence isn't isolated to Madeleine's example. There was a big 1991 study that found that these indigenous leafy vegetables in a specific department in Guatemala are absolutely crucial to providing children with the micronutrients that are necessary. So our primary goal that leads us to our plan for our project is to increase family use of these indigenous leafy vegetables. And as a result, we plan to financially empower female community entrepreneurs and increase social cohesion. And our plan is to develop a no-interest microloan scheme that encourages partnerships between indigenous female community entrepreneurs and local midwives to increase micronutrients in children's diets.
Yes, so we are choosing to do the pilot version of this program in the Department of Alta Verapaz, which is the second largest department in Guatemala outside of Guatemala City and its suburbs. Additionally, this is a department with one of the highest rates of indigenous people, therefore the group of people most affected by malnutrition, and our 1 million USD budget will go to each of the 17 municipalities within the department.
So we have a 3-step plan for kind of rolling out our project. Our first step is an education and training conference. So the Guatemala Ministry of Health and Social Assistance will host a symposium training program on the benefits of leafy greens and on ways to incorporate these greens in day-to-day diet. So we envision these sessions will range from meetings with nutritionists to cooking demonstrations to a kind of business boot camp. So these women can come back to their communities and create a community garden, which will be discussed in the future. And the main goal of this symposium is to make the adoption of these leafy greens intuitive, fun, and really attractive for the women. And so we're going to make this conference fun. We want cooking competitions and etc. to make these women excited about leafy greens, to make them really buy in so that they bring it back to their communities and they're excited about this. With regards to participants, we're going to recruit 4 indigenous female leaders from each municipality to attend, so that's going to be 68 women in total. And we're going to have 4 from each municipality to make sure we account for any language or regional differences, and also to maximize the reach of our program. We're using indigenous female leaders specifically to heighten transparency and trust within the community. We think there's going to be less buy-in if you have a foreigner coming in and telling you what to do, but if you have someone who lives in your community, who is trusted within your community and really understands the nuances of social cohesion, we think that this will be most effective.
Right, so the key aspect of microloans in this project is that they are no interest, which allows for these women to have the highest chance of success possible, but to also ensure the longevity and sustainability of this program. So the idea is that the women who are trained at these conferences will come back to their communities, create collectives engaging other women in their community to grow these greens in community gardens, sell them at the markets, and engage the rest of their community in cooking demonstrations, competitions, encouraging people to come up with creative ways to include the greens into their daily diet. We've seen a lot of interesting ways to include these vegetables into tortilla, which is a key food for these groups. So just encouraging creativity and fun so that people want to do this and it's not something that people are not excited about. So then another important part of the microloan is that the local midwife will get 10% of the share of profits from the community gardens. And this is really important because midwives have a unique and trusted role in these societies, in that they are probably the only female with any sort of social status. So because they're revered and trusted, they will likely increase the legitimacy of community buy-in because midwives heal with traditional medicine, and a lot of the time these communities only believe in traditional medicine. They have very large distrust for new ideas, so midwives can offer a lot of needed legitimacy as well as capitalize on the fact that they have the highest amount of face time with targeted individuals in this program, being mothers and children. And then finally, the 4 women from each municipality who come back from the conference will hold each other accountable to repay the loans, encourage each other to make the program successful.
So the final crucial aspect of this program will be the creation of a central database to both track metrics and compile nutritional information recipes for the program. And we intend for this database to be a tool for both community garden owners and for the accountability administrators, which is going to be discussed in the next slide a little bit more. And we're really leaning into our community focus and are aiming for trust by hiring administrators from local coding programs to create the database. Madeleine can talk a little bit more about specific rollout for this database.
Yeah, so accountability metrics are going to be really important in this program. We envision a donor NGO supplying the funding for the program. So they will then train a monitoring team of independent Guatemalan professionals, some with coding experience, some with general education, to both create this database online, as well as act as the inspecting body for evaluating project impact. And we plan on the Guatemalan government cooperating with this plan as the purse strings will be attached to the donor NGO.
And this is where our centralized database is going to be key.
Yeah.
So with regards to budget, we propose to have about 10% of the budget going to recruiting Indigenous female community organizers, also to increasing local government buy-in through advocacy movements, because as Madeleine mentioned, it's going to be really crucial to have our local municipal governments on board, not just our broader department. We're going to have about 25% to education and programming in the conference itself. About 20% will go to the microloans, and this is assuming about $4,000 per microloan, which the University of California proposes as a pretty solid metric. About 10% to the database, that's both creation, maintenance, and hiring the administrators. About 25% for the accountability metrics. And the final 10% is for the community engagement events that we talked about to make sure this is fun, this is social, and this is really a force for good in society. And that adds up to $1 million. That was an earlier PowerPoint that got submitted. And this is going to be a sustainable project. First off, the very premise of the no-interest microloan provides a safeguard for fiscal salience because it's a loan. There are expectations of repayment. There's going to be minimal environmental impact because we're using already indigenous plants, so we won't be bringing in or domesticating any plants that could have broader environmental harm. And the database creation is going to be really crucial with future viability. It'll provide clear instructions and material for these future gardens, and it'll make it a more replicable project.
Right, so finally, the way we are going to judge our impact outcomes is that the impact evaluators we discussed earlier will keep a close eye on the money and how it reaches the communities by keeping tabs on the bank accounts of the receivers of these loans. And then secondly, our ultimate goal with the program is to diversify at least 25% of the family's diets in Altaverapaz. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This one's me, right, Eric and Sarah? Okay. Thanks. Well, first I want to know how much you had to pay the organizers to get a Guatemala example, since you have the direct experience there. That
right? They sent out the case yesterday, and we were like, no way. What are the odds?
Well done. Well done. No, you can. So I really like the presentation, and I like that you both seem very excited about the idea. The question I will throw to you first is, how do you see this as being part of the, as being a governance project, as being part of the governance stream?
Yeah, Madeleine, do you want to?
It's going to be a project housed underneath the Guatemalan Ministry of Health. And so, yes, we do include an NGO in our explanation of it. However, in discussions with mentors, we discuss the fact that often NGOs are involved in creating public policy in Guatemala because a lot of money is tied to the will of NGOs. So we were concerned about that, but we discussed the realisticness with mentors. And while it does include other independent groups than the government, it's realistically something the government would do.
And I think it's crucial to remember that it is a part of, and I'm pulling up the name right here, it is part of the Guatemala Ministry of Health and Social Assistance. So they are the overarching organization that will facilitate this initial conference.
One more question, then I'll hand off to the other judges.
Yeah.
How are you going to get the $1 million?
Oh, I thought that was just.
It's just given to you?
I thought that was a given. I thought that was like the challenge. You're given $1 million. What will you do with it?
Yes.
Oh, is that right, Nathan? Okay,
Yes.
Sorry. Nathan's going to give you $1 million.
Yeah.
Sarah and Eric, I want to hand over to you so we can.
Go ahead, Eric.
First of all, I love the energy and I love the presentation styles. So kudos to that. Keep that up. I have a question about the database. Did you do any research about internet access among the affected communities? I mean, how accessible is that database going to be to the folks who could use it the most?
Yeah, okay, so we found some really interesting facts. First off, Guatemala is really very strong in terms of mobile proliferation. And that doesn't necessarily mean smartphone proliferation, although they are one of the leaders in Latin America in that sense. But that's why we really focus on the fact that the accountability administrators will be the ones who will be disseminating that information from the database. So we do envision more of an urban focus for the accountability administrators who will then bring that information to the rural town. So that's where that partnership will be crucial.
Right. The actual sharing of information is going to be predominantly through word of mouth and possibly recipes, information written down in the Mayan languages. However, we probably can't count on that too much because literacy is not, basic literacy would probably be okay to count on, but it would predominantly be word of mouth.
Right. And that's also where we're going to have those garden, kind of the social events that we talked about, having the cooking competitions and having those real community engagement events that we have about 10% of our budget set out for is going to be really key.
So is it safe to say then, based on what you just told me, that the database more is kind of a knowledge management repository, kind of best practices, teaching aids, recipes and stories that other folks can share within their communities, versus actually being the source of information that people actually go and tap into the information, that the community members go and tap the information themselves?
Yes, and we envision it to serve more of a macro purpose when looking at the replicability of this project in the future, to make sure it doesn't, work in one community and then stop there.
I don't know, Sarah, if you have any other questions.
I was thinking about kind of the behavior change aspect of this. And so my question is how, I think this is really interesting. I was trying to remember if it was Mexico or Guatemala that started prosecuting Indigenous midwives for basically if there's a death on their watch, that they would potentially be prosecuted, and it's really endangered kind of midwifery in I couldn't remember which country is doing that. And I think it's a really interesting strategy to work through these women who are seen as, kind of community leaders. But it's okay if people aren't eating these greens. How do you get them to eat them and to buy them in the market? Because there's an assumption that also this is a revenue generating activity.
Yeah. And that's where that excitement and engagement at that initial training conference is going to be crucial. In terms of looking at recipes, there are already some recipes that are starting to spread in Guatemala, looking at how you can incorporate it into tortillas, and looking at really easy kind of intuitive ways that won't seem so foreign. And so that's where those training conferences are going to be key, looking at really natural ways in which we can incorporate this into the diet and then bringing those women back to their communities.
So we will move to deliberation right now. Time's up for Q&A. Thank you for the team.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.